Welcome to City Lights Live, everyone. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis, and today we inaugurate the first event of the fall 2024 season. We can't think of a better way to do so than by welcoming back to City Lights a writer whose work we've been following with great enthusiasm for many, many years. It is a pleasure and an honor to have with us once again Elif Shafak, and to be able to celebrate the publication of her new novel titled There Are Rivers in the Sky, published by Alfred Knopf. Before we begin, as is customary, I would like to point out we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, aka the San Francisco Bay Area. We would like to take this moment to offer our respects. Elif Shafak is an award-winning and international best-selling author, essayist, and political scientist and activist. She has produced 20 books, 13 of which are novels, and her writing has been translated into numerous languages. Her novels include The Island of Missing Trees, The Architect's Apprentice, The 40 Rules of Love, amongst others. The book we're celebrating today, There Are Rivers in the Sky, is an exquisitely crafted and beautiful feat of storytelling that adds to what is already a remarkable body of work. Joining Ms. Shafak in conversation, we're delighted to have with us once again Ipek Burnett, we've had the great pleasure of working with over the years. She is a Turkish-American novelist, essayist, poet, and cultural critic. She is the author of A Jungian Inquiry into the American Psyche, The Violence of Innocence, and is the editor of Revisioning the American Psyche, Jungian Archetypal and Mythological Reflections. She is currently the co-chair of the Human Rights Watch's Executive Committee in San Francisco and serves on the board of 826 Valencia. So please join us now in offering a warm welcome to Elif Shafak in conversation with Ipek Burnett. Welcome to you both. It is such a pleasure and an honor to have you with us again.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, City Lights, for bringing us together for this conversation, which I know will be very engaging, very thought-provoking, and inspiring, because I had the great pleasure of interviewing Elif Shafak before for City Lights 2 other times, and each time I walked away with my mind and my heart so full, so well-nourished. Elif, welcome back. Tekrar hoş geldin.
Hoş bulduk. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Peter, for bringing us together, making this possible. And Ipek, I'm so grateful, and I'm so excited to share this platform, together, and really looking forward.
Thank you, Elif. And today I'm so excited. We're going to be talking about your brand new novel, There Are Rivers in the Sky, which is such a poetic title, first of all, and then it's such a complex book. And if I may say so, also an ambitious narrative, really weaving together some of these themes of utmost importance, climate change, religious intolerance, political violence, of course, class struggle and oppression of women. And here in this beautiful, beautiful book, we get to encounter the interwoven story of 3 distinct characters. Actually, the book starts in ancient Nineveh in Mesopotamia in a royal, magnificent library, which is then destroyed. And then from there, we move to Arthur, 19th century scholar. And then from there, we move to 21st century. We meet Narin, who is a Yazidi girl living in Turkey. And then, of course, Alika, who is a British scholar studying water in London. In the note to reader, you make it abundantly clear, crystal clear, how much research, interdisciplinary research, went into this book, from biology to, of course, history to mythology. So how did it all begin among these storylines, among these characters, ideas? What was the starting point, that first inkling, first inspiration for you?
Yeah, I so appreciate this, You're right. The canvas of this book looks quite broad in the sense that the story does span centuries and countries and cultures. But in reality, everything started with a single tiny drop of water, just a little raindrop. And so I just wanted to perhaps honor that droplet. And I think in so many ways, when we talk about climate crisis today, we are primarily talking about freshwater crisis. And for those of us coming from the Middle East, this is not some theoretical, abstract debate, but actually it's an acute reality in the sense that of the most water-stressed 10 nations in the world today, 7 are in the Middle East and in North Africa. So basically, as we're speaking, our rivers are dying, our rivers are drying, and this has massive consequences, of course, for everyone, but primarily for women, because women are usually water carriers. You know, they bring water to their communities. And when there's no water nearby, the distance that a young woman needs to walk in order to find water increases, unfortunately increasing the possibility for gender violence on the way. So my point is everything is actually connected. I just wanted to perhaps write a love letter to water, to a tiny little droplet. I wondered if I could build an entire novel on a tiny raindrop. Maybe it's a little bit of a mystical question in the sense of a bit like William Blake's, grain of sand. But that droplet brought me to the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh brought me to this fascinating Victorian scholar. Maybe we'll talk about him in a little while. And so one thing led to another. All I did was to allow it to flow. And I just followed that flow. So rather than dominating the narrative as an author, I trusted the flow of the narrative. So it began with a raindrop and then it turned into a river. Yeah.
Oh, I love that, Elif. I love how this is really such an intricate tapestry, this novel, and the fact that it is water that weaves all of this together throughout centuries and people, and the eco-psychology, that ecological consciousness you bring to the novel. And then in the novel you write, water remembers. It is humans who forget. So this is because ultimately this book is a book about memory, a story about memory, right? Remembering and forgetting. Can you talk about this idea of water having memory, the consciousness in nature?
Yeah, thank you. I think overall we need to rethink about entire relationship with nature or lack thereof. We tend to think that we are above nature or somehow outside of nature. We have turned ourselves, as human beings, we have turned ourselves into consumers of nature. So everything is for consumption and as fast consumption as possible. That is the basis of our relationship with our environment. Water we consume, soil we consume, trees, fruits we consume, and so on. But I think what we need to realize, and pretty urgently, is that we are not above nature. We're only a tiny little part of a very complex ecosystem. And so when we destroy water, when we tend to think that there's a lot of water in the world, but actually, as we mentioned, it's a time of water scarcity. So when we take things for granted and when we treat nature so terribly, we're also damaging ourselves and our future. It was all about connections. The question about water memory is so interesting. I came across this in folklore, maybe in folk tales, I should say, but I've also come across this in science. And that was the interesting thing for me. There have been scientists who have been almost obsessed with this idea. And so there is a theory in the book which is based on a real scientist, a French scientist who became very, very preoccupied with this idea. But overall, I think it was my way of saying we need to learn from water. Like when I look at the Thames River today, maybe we'll talk about it. It's this beautiful river that shapes London, but we take it for granted. We forget that it's a zombie river in the sense that it was dead not that long ago. It was biologically declared dead. It was so filthy because we human beings mistreated the river to such an extent. But today it's home to more than 200 biospecies. So the river has managed to renew itself, recreate itself. But we humans don't learn much from history. And right now, as we're speaking, water companies in the UK are pumping sewage into the same river, into the Thames, for greed, for profit, because money is the only value. So my point is, water remembers the things that we as human beings seem to forget very easily.
Yeah, and also in the novel you talk about lost rivers, right? The people built cities, right, on the shores of rivers, and then expanded those cities, expanded and pushed the rivers to the degree that they had to go underground. And though we may not see that river, it's still beneath us. And which again brings me back to memory, to remembering and forgetting. Though we talk about collective amnesia from time to time, there are always those in society who remember, who carry the stories of their ancestors, those very silenced memories. And in this novel, you beautifully display that with the story of the Yazidi family. And there's this Narian's family, there's this conversation where the grandmother says, "We are here, but our history is elsewhere." And then Narian's father responds, "We are the memory tribe." And then you come back to this, I love this idea of the memory tribe, which you come back to and you say, children of uprooted parents are born into the memory tribe. Both their present and their future are forever shaped by their ancestral past, regardless of whether they have any knowledge of it. And as a Jungian, I find this really, of course, intriguing. And I would love to hear you talk more about ancestral heritage, this transgenerational inheritance, especially when it comes to displaced people, refugees, exiles, immigrants.
Yeah, indeed. And I love the way you connected this with buried rivers or lost rivers, because I think there's so many. Just because we don't see the past, it doesn't mean that it's dead. It doesn't mean that it's over. I think in so many ways, and this has Jungian connections as well. Of course, what is buried is still a part of this present moment, just like in those lost rivers. But if I may start with that subject, London is a city of buried rivers, but so is New York, so is Moscow, or Paris. We always talk about the Seine, but we rarely mention the Biv, which also was a famous river in Paris, except now it's buried under the ground. Or Tokyo, for instance, is a city or Athens, beautiful Athens. We go to Athens. It seems like there are no rivers in Athens, but actually there were rivers in Athens, except now it's under the ground. So what we've done all around the world is we have built entire cities upon rivers that we considered either too dirty or insignificant or unnecessary. And now with climate crisis, what is happening is with sea levels rising, more water is going into those underground rivers, causing more flash floods. This will increase, and what has been buried is coming back. And now there's a counter movement across the world, which is talking about bringing those buried rivers into daylight, and they call it daylighting. In South Korea, they've done this, and they've done it in a very successful way. So I like to also play with that metaphor. What are the things that we push under the ground? Memory is important. Memory is a responsibility. I'm not talking about being stuck in the past, but learning from the past, and hopefully never, ever again making the same mistakes that our great-grandparents might have made. But that requires learning. And I say this as a writer who comes from Turkey. As you know, Turkey, of course, has a very rich and long history, but that doesn't necessarily translate into strong memory. If anything, I think quite the opposite. We're a society of collective amnesia. And so if you are interested in the stories that are forgotten and sometimes conveniently forgotten by official history, in my opinion, as an author, you need to pay attention to oral storytelling. For instance, the moment I start asking questions about, okay, you're telling me the story of the Ottoman Empire, but how was the Ottoman Empire like for women? The moment you start asking this, there's a huge silence, because most of the history that is taught to us at school is his story, by which I mean the story of a very few men in positions of power and privilege. So if you're interested in the stories of men coming from poorer backgrounds or working class backgrounds or disadvantaged communities, again, there's a big silence. If you're interested in the stories of minorities, there's a big silence, and so on. And in that regard, I think to be a novelist is a bit like, you know, doing linguistic archaeology. You have to dig deep and go down those layers of silences. And that's what I try to do. I would love to say a few words later about the Yazidi minorities, because honestly, I think they're one of the most misunderstood and persecuted minorities in the world. But for them to keep their collective identity, this memory and transmitted through oral storytelling is incredibly, incredibly important.
Well, Elif, I mean that you actually, I was going to ask you about your occupation your vocation as an author, as an archaeologist, and you already answered that question. And I do want to come back to Yazidi community as well, because you always make space in your novels, for these stories of exile, forced migration, the plight of refugees, their struggles, tragedies. And I mean, in this novel, we see like how these people were fleeing floods, fleeing violence, leaving behind their villages, their homes, their pistachio trees, right? The graveyards. And your unique perspective as an immigrant, I think, is very important to that. And I do want to come back to it as well, but I also want to continue on this theme of burial and uncovering, burying and uncovering. So with that, can we quickly talk about Arthur, the 19th century scholar? He's such an intriguing character, so sensitive, so intelligent, genius, in fact. And he is born into poverty, struggles and makes it to, he becomes the celebrated scholar in London in 19th century. And then from there, he travels to Istanbul and all the way to Mesopotamia to excavate and uncover these fragments of clay tablets, right? And he has this amazing calling, vocation, and how you describe it in the book is restlessness of the heart. Can you talk about his journey and that restlessness at the core of his heart?
Indeed, indeed. So this is a book about three characters who seem to be very different at first glance, but are connected deeply and surprisingly. The relationship among them, for me, was as though in a water molecule. So there are three atoms, H2O, the two hydrogen atoms, and the oxygen atom at the center. Arthur is my oxygen atom in the book, and as you mentioned, he's born in Victorian England, in the slum tenements of Chelsea at the time. And I think if he were alive today, we would respect the beauty of his mind, the neurodivergence of his mind, and we would understand and appreciate that neurodivergence. But at the time, of course, he gets no such recognition, no support whatsoever. I need to tell right away that my character is loosely based on an actual historical figure called George Smith, about whom there's very little information. So I took little bits of information from actual George Smith's life, and I wanted to build an entire character with my imagination, you know, and feel free to do that as an author. And maybe it's a strange thing for me to say this, but I really, really love this character. I fell in love with this character as I kept writing Arthur. Now, the actual George Smith, or my character, King Arthur of the sewers and the slums, and there's a reason why he's given this name, he purely by coincidence starts to come to the British Museum, and there he sees these shattered clay tablets, cuneiform tablets from thousands and thousands of years back. And at the time, not many people can read. Very, very few people can even dare to approach the clay tablets. But he manages to piece them together. And slowly, slowly, he discovers the Epic of Gilgamesh, and he discovers the flood tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is so crucial. It creates a huge debate in Victorian England, not only on this side of the Atlantic, but in America at the time as well, because the story that he finds is very similar to the biblical story of Noah and the flood. So those who are religious say, well, you see, it proves that the holy books were telling the truth. But those who are more science-minded say, well, actually, we've been telling the same old stories throughout history over and over. So depending on where you are, it's at the very heart of this heated debate. But the actual George Smith and my character, they come to the Middle East, and George Smith today is buried actually between Turkey and Syria. Almost no one knows or pays attention to that. So a part of me wanted to honor this. A part of me wanted to appreciate the genuine dedication of individual scholars like him. But at the same time, you can also be quite critical of institutional colonial history. And that's the beauty of writing, or that's the beauty of literature, because there's room inside a novel for nuance thinking, for pluralism. Unlike on social media, I think novels can tackle with some of the most sensitive and complex issues of our times.
That is so fascinating, Elif, to hear about also the real person behind the story. And to go back to Arthur briefly, he does fall in love with a seer, right? And I wanted to ask you about that because it is related to what you're saying about science and spirituality. I remember this TED talk you gave many years ago in which you talk about your grandmother, right? And she was a healer, and there are healers in the story, seers, healers. How do you bring them all together in your novels? Like, there's science and there is spirituality, and how do you create this cohesive narrative, bringing that dynamic, holding that dynamic?
Yeah, I really appreciate this. I was raised by a traditional grandmother until I was 10 years old. I was born in France, but then my mom brought me to Turkey. And while my mother, because she was a young divorcee, she had dropped out of university, while she went back to college and restarted her studies, literally it was my grandmother who raised me until I was 10 years old. And it really stayed with me. She was not a well-educated woman, only because she had been pulled out of school for being a girl. Even though she loved learning, she was one of the wisest people I've ever met in my life. And I think she's the one who taught me that there are different paths towards wisdom and knowledge. You know, it's not, I mean, someone might graduate from the best universities in the world. That doesn't necessarily make them knowledgeable, or vice versa. Someone might not have the chance to go to school. That doesn't make them ignorant. There are different paths to knowledge. And it stayed with me. I mean, especially the oral culture of the Balkans, Anatolia, the Levant, the Middle East, the Mediterranean. There's a part of me that likes to pay attention to that world. I do not belittle that culture. And to the best of my ability, I would love my work to be a bridge builder between written and oral cultures, between perhaps the Eurocentric canon of the novel, which I love, which I grew up with, you know, afterwards. But I am also connected or tuned into another type of storytelling. And sometimes I think we forget that because of our Eurocentric way of thinking. So we forget that all around the world there are different types, traditions of storytelling, sometimes much more cyclical, like circles within circles, stories within stories. And I cannot forget that, you know. So as I said, to the best of my ability, I want my literature to connect seemingly different worlds.
And you do a seamless job at that. Thank you so much. You always are weaving together so many themes, and you're doing that with imagination and empathy and compassion. And since we were talking about your grandmother, I want to stay on the theme of women for a second. And this is perhaps the most important question I wanted to ask you. This is the question I'm most excited about. Nisaba, the goddess of storytelling, of writing, of agriculture. And you write about her in the novel, and you describe how she was displaced, how she was replaced by another deity, Nabu, who's a male god, of course. And then at the end of the novel, you write a personal note, a very humble note, and then you say, now and always praise be to Nisaba in a way, you placed this novel at her altar. Can you tell us more about this forgotten goddess and her significance, and also the significance of her disappearance, of course?
Yes, thank you so much for bringing this up. I think it's so important to remember that as we go back in time, so the stories of women have been erased, just taken out of history books, taken out of our collective memory. And the disappearance of Nisaba, I think it's heartbreaking, because she's the goddess of agriculture. She's the goddess of writing and literature, because as you go back in time, they're deeply connected, agriculture and how numbers and letters and alphabets grew, literature and literacy in general. And I think as writers, especially, or as readers, as book lovers, we need to remember Nisaba. It's so interesting the way she has been pushed to the background. I mean, for a very long time, she's a very important goddess. But then as patriarchy is consolidated, you can see, as you follow the trajectory of history, you can see how she becomes an alternative male god, takes over her responsibilities, and she herself becomes either the devoted wife of Nabu or the secretary of Nabu, literally holding his, clay tablets and utensils in the background. That is incredible. I mean, how she's been relegated instantly, take that power taken away from her as patriarchy becomes stronger. So a part of me wanted to honor her. The book, as you said, has this little surprise at the very end, as if it were a clay tablet. Everything was, the whole novel were a clay tablet. It is dedicated to Nisaba. It's so interesting. As you go back in time, many scribes used to dedicate their cuneiform tablets to her, saying, now and always praise be to Nisaba. So I think it's something that we need to remember today. And it brings us back to that theme of stories and silences. I genuinely believe that as novelists, as poets, as short story writers, as people who dedicate their lives to literature, we cannot only be interested in stories. We also need to be interested in silences, and those who have been silenced. Literature has this incredible way of bringing the periphery to the center and making the invisible a bit more visible, the unheard a little bit better heard, and rehumanizing those who have been systematically dehumanized. And in that regard, I think at the heart of literature, there is resistance, there is rebellion, there's an unruly magic in its own gentle way, but definitely transformative power. I think literature has that.
I really appreciate that perspective on literature as an agent for change, for social justice, and really touching the lives of many. Thank you. And also this, I was really touched by Nisaba's, this reference to Nisaba, because as we all know, none of this is in the past. The threat to women's voices, bodies, their selfhood, it's very much with us, very disheartening, infuriating, in fact. And just last month, Taliban coded into law a ban on women's voices in public. So women are prohibited from speaking, singing, reading aloud in public spaces because their voices are deemed too intimate. That is the word, intimate. Can you share with us your thoughts on that and on where women's rights stand today?
Yes, absolutely. I really, really appreciate that we're talking about this, because I think that the plight of Afghan women is neglected, is ignored so easily. I have heard some experts, talk about how safe and secure Afghanistan has now become. And well, if women's rights is an issue, that's almost like a casualty of realpolitik. That cannot be the case. That is unacceptable. So women's rights, the rights of minorities, the rights of children always need to be a priority, We're talking about half of humanity here when we're talking about women's rights. But I think it's as heartbreaking and unacceptable the situation in Afghanistan is, in my opinion, it would be a mistake to think that, well, in other parts of the world, especially in the Western world, things are safe and steady and solid and secure. In late 90s and early 2000s, I think there were so many people, both in media and academia, adopting a very dualistic way of reading the world and talking about human rights and women's rights as if these were issues that could only concern people coming from liquid lands, lands such as Afghanistan or lands such as Turkey to a certain extent, that too, you know, because we've been going backwards in terms of women's rights for sure. So many people thought that, you know, if you come from those liquid lands, then you can worry about the future of democracy. Then you can worry about the future of women's rights. Understandably, you can be a feminist, but you have no reason to be a feminist if you live in the safe and solid Western world, because that world is over those concerns. That threshold has been, you know, is left behind. And I think where we are right now in 2024, we do understand that actually there is no such thing as liquid lands versus solid lands. In fact, we're all living through liquid times, as the late Zygmunt Bauman used to say, which means it can also happen in America. It can also happen in Europe. It can happen in Hungary, in Poland. You know, we're seeing bits and pieces in different degrees in so many countries. We cannot take democracy for granted. We cannot take women's rights or LGBTQ plus rights for granted. Things can go backwards so easily. And I think especially for women and especially for minorities, we need to become more passionate advocates of democracy and pluralism. If I may also add this, I really find it very important that we remain connected as human beings. I think it's an important moment for global solidarity, for global dialogues, and especially for global sisterhood.
And Elif, one of the things that I most appreciate about your work is exactly this, the strength and the power in your voice and conviction when you talk about human rights, whether it's women's rights, refugee rights, immigrants' rights, and how you bring that to literature itself, to your novels. Through storytelling, you really shed light on some of the most pressing issues, past and present. And also through storytelling, you cultivate empathy, because without empathy, there can't be any change, right? There can't be any dialogue. So I would love to hear your thoughts on literature being a messenger for empathy, and also how you, as a writer, get to that empathy when you are writing about your characters.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful question. I think, you know, what we teach I was thinking about this, at creative writing courses, we usually teach students or tell students, write what you know. And that has always troubled me, to be honest. Of course, we can write what we know, but the heart is bigger than that. And I think if we can say, write what you feel, genuinely feel in your heart, to me, that's a better starting point. Of course, to feel in your heart is not enough. We have to do our work, our homework as writers. We need to really, really do our research. We need to do a lot of learning, not only learning, but also unlearning. Unlearning is a big part of learning, because there are so many prejudices, biases that we internalize without even being aware of that. So sometimes when we start learning about an issue, there's a lot of dismantling and unlearning to do along the way. But I do believe that writers need to be good readers, good listeners, just be open. Just let's keep our minds curious. That childish curiosity is something we cannot abandon. But that said, there's a distinction here for me. I don't like it when writers try to preach or try to teach something or lecture. I find that quite off-putting, to be honest. I think it's not a writer's job to try to give the answers. I don't know the answers myself. The only thing I know is I care about the questions, including questions about difficult issues. So if we could open up a space, a free space, where we can talk about stories and silences, but then always leave the answer to the reader. It's very important for me that a writer does not try to dominate the narrative. You see what I mean? So there's a nuance for me there. And you mentioned empathy. Empathy is a big, big part of this. I think we're living in an age in which we are shaped by emotions. This is the age of anxiety. It is the age of anger. Maybe we can talk about all these emotions and how they affect us. But if there's one emotion that really, really scares me, that is the lack of emotions, which is numbness. You know, the moment we become desensitized, indifferent, the moment I say, well, what's happening in Afghanistan is no concern of mine. The moment I say what's going on in Gaza is no concern of mine, or in Ukraine, or in Sudan, you know. So I think we need to be careful about apathy and numbness. And in many ways, I think literature is the antidote of numbness.
That is so true. That is so true. And I think you accomplish that with your novels very beautifully. Like I said, the opening the heart. I agree with you that cynicism, anger, and not caring, they are much easier in a way, right? They shut down the heart, that they shut down any possibility for a dialogue. But it is only through imagination, through compassion and empathy, we can begin to really have dialogues and hopefully some change. And, you know, I also really appreciate this distinction you make. And as a writer, you're not after, you know, giving a lecture, giving answers. But what I find in your novels is the questions and also resonance. Sometimes as an immigrant, I resonate with certain things you say, and it's so powerful. It stays with me. One of those I want to share here. And it comes from Zelika's uncle, Uncle Malek, who is a complicated character. You know, he is really caught in the tension of East and West, and I'm not going to give away too much. But there's something he says, and I believe he says it a few times. He says, people like us cannot afford to fail. People like us. And by that, he means he's an immigrant. So he's talking about immigrants. He's talking about newcomers. He's talking about those in exile, the outsiders. Can you say more about that?
Yes, he's a complicated character, and of course he has his own bruises. But this issue of displacement, being an immigrant, which of course is one of the many things that connects us, you and I, Ipek. Not only that, not only us though, anyone who comes from a complex background, you know, any family history that has family stories and family silences. I think many people can relate to this. Like this pressure that you cannot fail, that you're representing something bigger than yourself. So I'm always intrigued by that. I'm also very intrigued by the question of trauma, you know, how it trickles down generations. And the elderly, usually, when I look at families that come from complicated and difficult histories, and in many immigrant families, the elderly are the ones who have probably experienced the biggest hardships, but they don't have a language for that. It doesn't mean, however, that they have forgotten what they went through. It just sits inside their chests, unspoken, all those unspoken words. And then when you look at the second generation, usually they're not interested in the past because they don't have either the time for that or the energy for that, because they have to start all over again, almost like a tabula rasa, you know. It has to be forward-looking, future-oriented. They need to find their feet in a new country. They have to succeed. So that success-driven impetus is very visible in the second generation, understandably. But that leaves the third or the fourth generations, the youngest in these families. I think they're the ones who are today asking the biggest, the sharpest questions about identity, ancestral heritage, and family traumas. And so you can come across a young person who is carrying the memories of the elderly. So a young person with old memory is possible. I'm always fascinated by that.
Me too, because as you know, my background being psychology, that really is one of those areas of inquiry I am most drawn to. And as you can imagine, I can talk to you about human rights, culture, psychology for days and days, but I also want to be mindful and come back to the novel itself. So I'm gonna take that course now and ask you about fun facts. Charles Dickinson, who makes a brief appearance in this novel. He's one of the characters. Can you tell us more about that? How he entered into the storyline here?
Yeah, indeed, and I really enjoyed writing that part. I mean, of course, Dickens himself is such a colorful, remarkable character, and he also played an important role in my life. You know, so like many authors, I think I feel like I'm indebted to him, or I feel connected to him in so many ways. However, when you look at his personality and life, on the one hand, his sense of justice, equality, class equality, how he feels empathy for the poorest in the society, all of that is remarkable. But at the same time, his perspective when it comes to non-Western communities is actually quite troublesome. So I wanted to also show that a little bit. But the reason why he is there in the story is because actual George Smith, he works in a publishing house that later on publishes some work with Charles Dickens. So a lot in this book is actually inspired by real historical events or connections. Sometimes I change the dates, all of which I explain at the end in the note to the reader. But historical facts also guided me, and I loved thinking about, did they really meet, you know, my character Arthur and Charles Dickens? And if that happened, how would that happen? You know, what would he say to this little boy coming from the slum tenements, so hurt and lonely, but clearly very talented? What would someone like Charles Dickens say to him? So I love thinking that, and I loved writing those sections in the book.
And I also follow your subtrack, so I know that these imaginary encounters, conversations do seep into your everyday life too, whether it's with Walt Whitman or Kafka. You write about those in those beautiful short essays. Can you talk about your relationship with those poets and writers of the past, how they sustain you in your writing?
Oh, thank you. It's a really beautiful question. Yes, I recently, a few months back, I started Substack, and I'm enjoying it. Once a week, I write about literature, cultural encounters, and of course, the beauty of writing literary pieces is you don't need to be very rational. Like in our daily lives, we're expected to speak in a certain way, more logic-centered, more reason-centered. But actually, once you enter the world of literature, you can say, well, trees whisper. You can say water speaks, you know, or like in my previous novel, a fig tree can be the narrator. You're taking risks when you do that as a writer. I'm not minimizing the risks, but it is possible. It can be done. So you can say that the world has its own magic. To be honest, I've never liked this term, magical realism. I think it's a little bit Eurocentric. It supposes that magic is very different than reality. But for instance, if you live in a city like Istanbul for a while, you realize that the city does not put different things in different boxes. It doesn't say, well, here's the box of humor, here's the box of tragedy. Sometimes when you live in Istanbul, in the saddest moment, there's an element of humor, or in the funniest moments, there's a melancholy underneath. So my point is, the city itself constantly blends everything. Life is like that. You know, there is magic in realism itself. They're not separate categories. And I feel so connected to so many authors, and I've learned so much from them. I think, you know, we mentioned this before, as writers, we're primarily readers and listeners. And when I say I'm a reader of books, I'm not only a reader of novels. I love novels, that's where my heart beats. But I also love learning from political philosophers. I love reading cookbooks. I love reading graphic novels, you know. Let us not buy into this duality, you know, the so-called highbrow literature versus lowbrow literature. What does that even mean? Who makes those distinctions? Nothing is high, nothing is low, but let's keep reading books. And most importantly, let's keep reading across the board, fiction and nonfiction, but also East and West, you know, as diverse as possible. I think that diversity is very important.
Since we're on the subject of, multiplicity and crossing borders, I know I talked to you about this before, but I want to bring it up again because I find it so compelling. And for those who are in the audience who might not have been with us last two times, about language, you write in two languages, you live with two languages. How does that reflect in your life, in your worldview, thinking and writing?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It really matters a lot to me, this question, because I do not see language as a tool, as a pencil that you use and put aside. I think it's a space we enter and it shapes us. It shapes our thinking. Language shapes us. So it has an incredible power over us. And I love languages plural. However, as you can hear in my accent, I am an immigrant, not only in the UK, but also in the English language. So this for me is an acquired language. And over the years, actually, Spanish was my second language. So English is my third language, growing up. So writing in a language that's not your mother tongue is actually quite scary, to be honest. And especially, if you're looking for the perfect English, then it's even scarier. But I'm not looking for that perfect English. All I know is that I connect with this language in my own way. You connect in a different way, someone else will connect in a different way, but there should be room for pluralism once again. And individually, when I look at my journey, my earlier novels were written in Turkish first, but about 20 years ago now, I switched. And that wasn't a very rational decision, because if I had started thinking about whether I could do this or not, probably I would be very scared. But it was more like an instinct. I needed more freedom. Being a Turkish writer is a very heavy experience. And I think especially if you're a women novelist in Turkey, it's even heavier. There are additional layers of sexism and patriarchy and misogyny that you need to deal with, and that are difficult to talk about. So, and anything you write, anything you say, from politics to sexuality, can offend someone, can offend the authorities. You can be sued, you can be prosecuted, put on trial, digitally lynched, and so on. All of which I have experienced. And there came a moment when I felt like, if I can write in another language, maybe it will give me a bit of cognitive distance. And that cognitive distance will bring me a bit more lightness and a bit more freedom. So I associate writing in English with freedom, despite it being difficult for me. That said, it doesn't mean that I have abandoned Turkish. How can I abandon my connection with my mother tongue? Is very emotional. My connection with English is more cerebral, perhaps a bit more intellectual, and I feel like I need both. But I feel freer personally writing my books in English. Nevertheless, I still believe that if my writing has melancholy, sorrow, longing, still those things are much easier to express in Turkish for me. When it comes to humor, which I love, humor is our oxygen. So humor, irony, and satire, I do find them much, much easier in English.
That is so fascinating, Elif. Thank you. And talking about your love of language, love of words, your passion for books and writing, and also this idea of freedom, right? Freedom to write and freedom to read. I want to talk about books because, as I mentioned, this novel begins in this royal ancient library, which is then destroyed. And as we know, and that you do mention this, I think in the note to the reader, there's libraries and books are increasingly under threat all around, including in the United States. We have actually, just in 2 weeks, we're going to be celebrating Banned Books Week here with City Lights and in the US, just to raise awareness about banned books. Can you talk a little bit about that, being a book activist, and also why you think books are why books pose such a threat to some in society, to some leaders, some of these people who are in positions of power.
Yeah, you're so right. My novel starts with this tiny little drop falling on the head of a very mighty king in ancient Mesopotamia, and that king is Ashurbanipal, uh, who has changed the course of history. Of course, when we talk about the library of Ashurbanipal, we're talking about a library that brought together thousands of clay tablets, including the Epic of Gilgamesh. And later on, when the entire city is burned down, destroyed by their enemies, the library is also gone. But the interesting thing about clay tablets is, unlike paper and unlike papyrus, when you burn down a library full of clay tablets, what happens is they become hardened, they become stronger. So they remained under the ground for centuries and centuries. Now, the reason why I mention this is because, to me, it's very interesting that sometimes the mightiest kings, they perish, of course, but the wealthiest empires, they perish, or the biggest architectural structures perish. But sometimes a poem just composed of mere words and breath survives the tides of time. That is remarkable. However, at the same time, as we celebrate the resilience of literature, we cannot, ignore the fact that our libraries are under attack today. As you mentioned, it is heartbreaking that in America there are so many banned or removed books, removed from school libraries. And actually, Pan America is keeping track of this. And so that number is unfortunately rising and rising. So it's quite alarming, especially when you compare the numbers, what they are today compared to what they were a year ago. There's definitely an increase in book bans and book removals, even in America. And then all around the world, we see attacks against writers, writers being prosecuted, imprisoned. Sometimes libraries are silently killed. They're not attacked physically, but by cutting the funding, by thinking that this is just a luxury that, can be discarded. When there are no libraries, the consequences of that for a society will be enormous. Oftentimes, especially for children coming from disadvantaged backgrounds, art and literature are the only way, when you want to connect with another possibility, with another existential opportunity, possibility, art is the way, or literature is the way, and it's libraries that are open and free for everyone. So by cutting that out, by making books a danger in the eyes of, the society, I think we're entering a very, very dark time. I don't think it's a coincidence that, especially in countries where we've seen authoritarianism increase, we've seen more attacks against either libraries or writers or books in general. That always goes hand in hand, because literature talks about nuances. Literature talks about pluralism. It is really in this world in which we're constantly pushed into dualistic categories. Literature does something very, very different. And it also celebrates ambiguity. It talks about connectivity, not simplicity that populist demagogues rely on, but a much more nuanced way of thinking. So all of that is a danger, of course, in the eyes of autocrats. And as we mentioned before, I don't think we can take it for granted that it will be fine. It will solve, by itself. I think we have to invest in libraries. We have to invest also in literary festivals. If I may quickly add this, I make a distinction following T.S. Eliot, of course, between information, knowledge, and wisdom. I think we're living in a world in which we are bombarded by information, but there's very little knowledge and even less wisdom. And we unfortunately conflate them. We tend to think that if you have enough information, then you're knowledgeable. But that's not the case. Just the opposite. Information is an obstacle in front of true knowledge. So libraries are there for true knowledge. We slow down inside a library. We cannot rush, and hopefully we should aim for wisdom, which requires the heart also to be part of the conversation. So wisdom, I think, brings the mind and the heart together. So I hope we can spend less time with snippets of information, but more time with knowledge and wisdom.
And if when we are in dark times, when, whether it's women's selfhood or books, refugees are under attack, when there are wars breaking everywhere, and then we're talking about, of course, climate change, when all of that is all around you, what gives you hope? What keeps you going? Because you're a very sensitive person, and I feel like you take it all and you really need it all and work with all this material. You never turn away from the dark realities. But what keeps you going?
Yeah, thank you. I think as artists, as writers, we have to remain engaged. We can't just say, well, I'm only going to talk about my own fiction. I don't want to talk about what's going on outside the window. We cannot touch life with gloves. We have to feel the heat, the cold. But at the same time, we have to try to take good care of our own inner garden. And I think that's very important. So how do we manage this is a question for me as well. I can't claim that I manage it well. Some days a bit better than others. The only thing I know is that I think it's okay for the mind to be a bit more pessimistic, as long as we can keep the heart hopeful and optimistic. And for that, we need to connect with our fellow human beings. When I hear your voice, something you say will inspire me tomorrow. When I hear about, let's say, the resilience or the struggle of women in Iran, right? That's going to give me hope. So connections are, I think, so essential. I find 3 layers of connections incredibly important. One, we connect with our fellow human beings across borders, in that spirit of global sisterhood or global solidarity. Secondly, we have to connect with nature, with trees, just sitting under a tree for half an hour, just walking by a river for a little bit changes our entire energy. Just to realize that we're a little speck in this very complex ecosystem, but we are connected to nature. We're not above it. And the third thing I think we need to connect with is our inner garden. Oftentimes we are so worried about the judgment of others. What will people say if I write this poem? What will people say if I make this art installation? Doesn't matter. It's the inner garden. The real energy has to come from within. So we have to take good care of that. But as what I'm trying to say is that we have to connect in order to find the hope and the optimism that the heart requires. And in the meantime, the mind can remain pessimistic. That's okay.
We talked about the restlessness of the heart with Arthur, and I do feel that for many artists, like you were talking about, many writers, that is true, that there is this restlessness of the heart which compels one to constantly search, yearn for more wisdom, not knowledge, wisdom, and moments of resonance. And though it might be at times difficult for a person in their personal lives, it is such a gift to humankind, to the world of literature, to readers like us. I feel like you are always restlessly, persistently, courageously searching and connecting us with centuries and different characters across time and landscape, and all these very, very important issues and stories. So thank you for all you do. And thank you also for showing us how literature and social responsibility can go hand in hand so beautifully. I, of course, have so many more questions to ask, but I want to be mindful of time. And if Peter can now come in and start taking questions from the audience, because I know, Elif, you really appreciate getting the questions from the audience as well. So if you have any questions, right now would be the perfect time to write them in the chat. And as much as our time allows us, Peter will be selecting some and offering them to Elif. And while we're waiting for that, for Peter to come on, if there's anything that I didn't touch upon that you really would like to speak about, please do so.
Oh, thank you so much. Really, thank you. This has been a fascinating conversation, every word of it. And I loved it very much. I don't think we've left out anything, we covered a big, a lot of ground. So I'll wait to hear from Peter.
So we have a question from Jonathan. One of the things I love most about your writing is the beautiful way you describe physical sensations and incorporate the senses into the narrative. Could you share with us how you use the senses in storytelling? I find the sense of smell particularly mysterious. Smells and stories have a long shared history.
That's such a wonderful and thought-provoking question. But you're right. I mean, I think in my writing, senses play an important role. And again, maybe it's the impact of Istanbul on me. You know, it's a city of sights and smells and sounds. But I also believe, I mean, and I've read about this as well, there's a very direct connection between our memory and all those, you know, smells and tastes. And that's why for so many writers, going all the way back to Marcel Proust, of course, sometimes the taste of this little can take it back to your childhood. We're always endlessly interested in that. I am, for sure. But I think that's also how I perceive life, how I connect with life. The things that I remember through stories, but I also remember through that sensual connection, either be it touch or smells or sounds. And I think when we can describe it in that way, the reader can also remember more vividly. Yeah, so that the connection between senses and memory is endlessly interesting to me, but I respect that connection very much.
Yasmin comments, thank you very much. My question is, water has been found on other planets as well as on Earth. Have you considered writing about water from a different perspective or writing about the Earth's small place in the universe someday?
Yeah, brilliant question. I'm following this story like you, Yasmin, and I'm learning from it. It would be very selfish to think that there's life only and only on our planet. I believe. I mean, there's so much out there that we are yet to discover. And that's fascinating. I love learning from science. Maybe one day I would like to write about, you know, in the olden days in the Ottoman Empire, they used to call them stargazers, you know, people whose job was to look up and try to solve the mystery of the universe. And that's something that really, really intrigues me, indeed.
Aaron comments, regarding vernacular and dialects, they help to describe our stories and lives and preserve our past, keeping lives and times alive.
True. And it comes again, it brings us back to our connection with language, being open to that pluralism, right? The heritage, not just, it's not a linear path, it never was. But I think to have the ear for that is also so important. So to hear that dialect, that in songs, in folk tales, in oral culture, rather than insisting on one, you know, proper way of writing or speaking, just being open to this, because that's, again, language is a river, and it's incredible, and its lifespan is much, much bigger than our lifespan. If I may share this with you, I mean, one of the things that fascinates me about the English language is that how it brings words from all kinds of backgrounds. So you say kismet, or you say chutzpah, and nobody says, wait a minute, the first one is an Arabic word, the second one is a Jewish word. You know, take them out of the English language, they're not English original. No one says that. They're organically part of the river of language. I like that. I like that openness. So I'm always interested in, yeah, how a language brings together, as long as it's organically a part of its course. I think that all words are welcome. I love that.
Karen says, could you follow up on the scientist who studied water extensively, more on Yazdi, please?
About the Yazidis, so we're talking about one of the, we briefly touched upon this, one of the most persecuted minorities, not only in the Middle East, but across the world. Now, as you know, as you will remember, in 2014, ISIS militants, extremists, started a genocide against the Yazidi minorities. This happened in front of the eyes of the world, but the Yazidi lore talks about 72 massacres at least. So this is a minority, a very vulnerable, beautiful minority that has been attacked at least 72 times. One thing that I want to share with you, just maybe tying together all the issues that we talked about, the very first thing that ISIS fanatics did before attacking this minority was to poison their water. So they poisoned the wells and they poisoned the fountains. And then the second thing they did was they killed the elderly. Now, the Yazidi community is heavily reliant upon oral culture rather than written culture. So when you kill the elderly, you kill collective memory. And then the fanatics killed the men and they kidnapped women and girls. As we're speaking right now, there are more than 3,000 Yazidi women who are still missing and unfortunately turned into sexual slaves. And as I was writing this book, one of those girls was found in a house in Ankara, very close to the neighborhood where I grew up, you know, my maternal grandmother's house. So it really struck me hard, like, how does this happen? How is it possible that a person can be kept captive there and an entire neighborhood somehow either doesn't see or is not interested? In that sense, I think the Yazidi genocide is not over. There's a lot of individual and collective healing that needs to take place. And to me, it was very interesting. One of the most difficult chapters to write was the moment in Sinjar Mountain when families had to ration even a tiny drop of water in order to keep their children alive. So it all, you know, brings us back to that story of raindrop.
Burkak comments, you dedicated the book to a woman who helped brainstorm with you by the Thames River. Could you talk about a bit more about her and who she is?
Oh, brilliant question. Actually, that woman is Virginia Woolf. As I was writing this book, I gave a lecture at Cambridge University. I gave a room of one's own lecture. And to me, it was very interesting how Virginia Woolf was pondering this question about women and fiction by a river. So I just wanted to make that little connection. Maybe in a second edition, I will mention that it's Virginia Woolf, but that's the little puzzle, yeah.
Yeah. So I think we have time for one more question. Hannah says, loved your conversation. Would you say more about your interdisciplinary approach to writing? How do you approach a new novel?
Thank you. Really appreciate this. I love learning from multiple disciplines. Of course, primarily I read novels, but I think as novelists, we're curious about anything, you know, everything. It really breaks my heart when readers, and it's usually male readers above a certain age who say this, they say, you know, so much is happening in the world and I want to understand. I want to keep up, you know, catch up. So I read more about finance, technology, economy, history, philosophy, important things. And then they say almost apologetically, they say, but my wife reads fiction. My girlfriend reads fiction, you know? And this really breaks my heart. I think inside fiction, there is technology, philosophy, history, psychology, you know, whatever is inside life, in part of life is part of fiction. But perhaps more importantly, inside a work of fiction, there's emotional intelligence. And I don't know a single human being who does not need to connect with their emotions. Whatever we do in life, we might be designers, politicians, dentists, we have to connect with our emotions. So fiction does deal with truth. It's very unfortunate that we use the word fiction and truth as if they were completely mutually exclusive things. But fiction does deal with truth in its own unique way. So I think when you're a novelist, depending on what the story brings, I can start reading about anything and everything. When I was writing The Island of Missing Trees, I was reading about mosquitoes, about fig trees. You know, for this book, there was an insane amount of research, from water science to ancient Mesopotamian rituals and how do you make gingerbread cuneiform cookies. But I love that, you know, just to be a student of life. It's something that I cherish.
Thank you so much for this. We find ourselves now at the top of the hour. Ipek, would you like to say a few final words before I wrap it up with us?
Thank you, Peter. Yes. And first of all, I mean, Elif, thank you so much for this incredibly rich conversation, this beautiful and powerful novel, and for everything you do as such a dedicated advocate for human rights, for literature, for books, for people everywhere. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ipek, for your generous heart, this brilliant conversation, every word of it. Thank you, Fitze, and thank you everyone who joined us. I'm very grateful.